Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. In this episode, we explore the fascinating science of epigenetics and how trauma doesn't just affect the mind, but can actually leave a biological imprint on our DNA, passed down through generations. From the lasting effects of war and famine to the global impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we examine how stress can shape human biology over time. The conversation also turns to cannabis, its increasing use as a coping mechanism, its influence on gene expression, and what current research reveals about its long-term effects. Stay tuned as we discuss how the environment, daily choices, and even your ancestors' experiences might be influencing your DNA and your efforts to age well.
Yeah, I'm really excited for today's episode. I've come across something that I think it's really going to blow your mind, Dr. Armstrong. See, I found this article on intergenerational transmission of trauma and how trauma can be passed down from one generation to the next in ways that we never could have imagined. Basically, trauma can actually alter the DNA and even the DNA of the future generations of whoever it traumatized. And this to me, this kind of sounds like the origin story of a superhero.
Well, I don't know about the superhero part, but I am fascinated by the epigenetics. And for our listeners and viewers who might not know, epigenetics is a study of how environmental factors and lifestyle choices can influence gene expression without necessarily altering the DNA sequence. So to me, this is such an exciting area of research. The idea of our experiences leaving a molecular imprint on our genes, and that those changes can actually affect future generations. I think that's pretty cool. Now, regarding this study, it's like trauma isn't just emotional. It becomes more biological. So studies are showing that trauma can leave epigenetic scars that not only impact the person who experienced the trauma, but can also be passed down to their descendants. And I frequently share the quote in my exercise science classes from Per Olaf Astrand, who said, "If you want to be an elite athlete, choose your parents wisely." And I've come to kind of modify that a bit. I start telling my students, if you want to be an elite athlete, choose your grandparents wisely.
Yeah, exactly. Which is funny because I don't think they have a choice in the matter.
Well, we don't know.
The article that I came across, it was written by Yehuda and Lerner, which dives deep into how trauma, things like war, extreme stress, doesn't just affect the person who experiences it. It actually changes the way genes are expressed in their offspring. And that's wild that these changes might even affect generations after. This study is also referred to in another article I came across in the New York Post that discussed the context of war and violence. Researchers has shown that the trauma from events like the Syrian war can lead to lasting epigenetic marks on DNA of survivors, and those marks can actually be inherited by their children and even grandchildren. And I think that's incredible.
Yeah, it is pretty huge. And it makes you think about the long-term effects of events like war, famine, and even something like the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we're living in a time of collective trauma. And this research really suggests that the impacts could be far more reaching than we think. That study on the families who survived violent conflict in Syria, both during the 1980s and the 2011 uprising. And the researchers examined DNA from 3 generations of these families and found clear epigenetic modifications. And these are altered genetic markings. And these are linked to the trauma the parents experienced. And these modifications were present not just in the children, but even in the grandchildren of those who lived through the violence.
And it also ties with what we're seeing today. Take the last few years of chaos, for example. For some, it's been a huge source of stress. We've seen wars, famines, natural disasters, and of course, a global pandemic. Could these type of environments be altering DNA in ways to make future generations more susceptible to stress, mental health issues, and even physical illness?
It's entirely possible. The concept isn't just theoretical. Studies have already shown that children of Holocaust survivors, for instance, often show signs of anxiety, depression, and hypervigilance, even though they weren't even directly exposed to the trauma of genocide. And these symptoms have been linked to changes in stress hormone regulation, something that epigenetic mechanisms could explain.
So we're talking about real changes in how genes are expressed. It's like the trauma of the parents is encoded in their biology and is passed down to their children. To me, I think that's powerful. The study also mentions how things like maternal stress during pregnancy or even preconception trauma in parents could affect the way that the offspring's genes are expressed. This can influence brain development and stress hormones, right?
Exactly. And this goes beyond just what the parent feels. The biological environment, like cortisol levels during pregnancy, and even the levels during puberty when the hormones are developing, when the eggs are developing in the female, the sperm are developing in the male, these can impact fetal development. And for example, research on famine exposure during pregnancy has shown that children born to mothers who endured famine tend to have a higher risk of mental health disorders and chronic diseases like diabetes later in life. Take the study on the war in Syria. The researchers identified specific sites in the DNA of mothers, children, and even grandchildren that showed altered methylation patterns. What's striking is that these epigenetic changes aren't random. They're linked to stress and trauma, and with direct evidence of how these experiences are passed down biologically across generations.
And it's not just biological effects, there's societal layers to it too. Right now, we're seeing high levels of anxiety and depression globally due to the pandemic. Dr. Armstrong, do you think that this current global trauma could be having long lasting effects, not just on those directly affected, but on their children too?
Well, absolutely. And I think we've seen a sort of trauma cascade in real time. With the COVID-19 pandemic, uncertainty and collective stress may very well have altered the way genes are expressed in children of parents who lived through it. If we're not addressing these stressors, especially for very vulnerable populations, this could have lasting effects on physical and mental health.
And we're not even including mRNA, are we, in regards to long term physical health?
No, I'd like to just stick to the subject of epigenetics today, but because the current mental health crisis linked to COVID-19 pandemic, social isolation, economic stress, politics, and all the other shit going down in the world, the stress, anxiety, and fear so many people have experienced and are experiencing could be, we could be looking at a wave of mental health issues in future generations.
And it's a cycle, right? I mean, without intervention, trauma gets passed down and the effects get compounded. And that's why it's so important to provide support, mental health services, trauma informed care, and community healing. So we can start breaking that cycle, which kind of segue into our next subject. Now, I'm sure you know that some people are doing their best to cope with whatever it is that they're going through, but some tend to go a path of self medication. And with the legalization of cannabis in most of the continental US, I came across a couple of interesting reads. One study focused on cannabis use and its link to epigenetic changes, and the other examined how cannabis use, both recent and cumulative, affect DNA methylation. Dr. Armstrong, these articles really made me think about how stress relief practices like cannabis use can impact us, even at a genetic level.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and it's one that ties perfectly into really what we've been discussing about how our environment and behaviors influence our health. But before we continue, let's explain what methylation is. Methylation is a chemical process where a methyl group attaches to DNA, influencing gene expression and potentially affecting an individual's traits and health without changing the genetic code itself. Now let's break these studies down. And what did the first study say?
Yeah, the first paper was published in Nature Molecular Psychiatry. The researchers explored the relationship between marijuana use and DNA methylation, specifically looking at both recent and cumulative use over time. The researchers found that marijuana use affected hundreds of DNA methylation markers, which are regulatory processes that can turn genes on or off without altering the DNA sequence. They identified genes linked to psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorders, as well as genes related to cellular proliferation, hormone signaling, and immune responses.
Yeah, this study touches on something critical in epigenetics, how our lifestyle choices, like cannabis use, affect gene expression over time. The changes aren't in the DNA sequence themselves, but in how genes are activated or silenced. As you pointed out, some of the genes affected by cannabis use are tied to conditions like schizophrenia, which suggests a potential long term impact on mental health. So there's also a growing body of evidence suggesting that substances like cannabis could be influencing the very pathways that regulate stress and emotional responses, which is something we should be very cautious about.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things that struck me. I mean, while cannabis is legal in many states and is used to treat everything from chronic pain to anxiety, the research is still catching up with the widespread usage. We often see people turning to it as an outlet for stress, but here's the thing: using it regularly might be altering the epigenomes in ways that we don't even fully understand.
You bring up a great point. The societal acceptance of cannabis as a quote unquote safe stress release tool doesn't necessarily mean we understand its long term effects. Just because something is legal doesn't always mean it's harmless. DNA methylation study that you mentioned suggests that long term marijuana use could lead to epigenetic changes that might be associated with psychiatric disorders and altered brain function. And to build on what we've talked about before, stress and trauma leave epigenetic marks. So if someone is already dealing with stress or trauma, adding to that with a substance like cannabis might compound the issue.
That's a key insight, Dr. Armstrong. When we look at trauma, we know it changes the epigenomes, influencing the stress response system, and even passes through changes down to future generations. So, if cannabis is affecting gene expression in ways we're not fully aware of, it could be adding another layer of the complex web of environmental stressors that impact our DNA.
Absolutely. We've seen this in the trauma studies we discussed earlier. Epigenetic changes from trauma can affect not just the person who experienced it, but also their descendants. It's similar with substances like cannabis, even if it's used for what seems like benign purposes. It's important to consider the broader biological impacts. And these aren't necessarily permanent, but they could influence our risk for a range of disorders, from mental health issues to chronic diseases.
And then this brings me to my second article that I found, which was from Science Alert. This one discussed how cannabis use is linked to epigenetic changes and gene expression. The study looked at how cannabis alters DNA methylation patterns in the brain and other tissues. And it finds that long term use can potentially lead to negative health outcomes, including cognitive decline and changes to how we even process stress.
And it's something we see across many lifestyle choices, whether it's diet, exercise, or substance abuse. Our behaviors are constantly interacting with our epigenome. While some behaviors might seem like quick fixes, like using cannabis to reduce anxiety or stress, over time, these can have unintended consequences. For example, cannabis is known to affect the adrenocannabinoid system. It's a mouthful always to say, but which plays a crucial role in regulating mood and stress. And when we disrupt that system, it could lead to changes in how we handle stress in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it gets even more complicated when you think about how we're using cannabis socially. It's becoming more common for people to turn to cannabis as a way to cope with stress of everyday life, work, family, and global events like the ongoing crisis in Ukraine or economic instability. It's also like we've normalized it as an easy way out, but at what cost?
Well, stress is a huge factor in today's world. People are under more pressure than ever, and cannabis seems like an easy escape. But just like trauma, it can leave epigenetic marks. So can substances we use to cope, alcohol and other substances. The key, I think, is balance. Yes, cannabis might offer temporary relief, but it's crucial for us to also consider long-term strategies for managing stress, like a healthy diet, regular exercise, and of course, mindfulness.
Yeah, it's about finding sustainable solutions, isn't it? I think as a society, we're leaning too heavily into substances to cope. When things like exercise and proper nutrition are natural ways to regulate our stress levels and support our mental health.
Exactly. And exercise has profound effects on the brain. It reduces the production of stress hormones like cortisol, and it increases the release of endorphins. And these all naturally boost the mood. And diet plays a huge role. Foods like foods that are rich in antioxidants, your omega-3 fatty acids and other nutrients, also support brain health and can help to buffer some of the effects of stress.
And this isn't just about feeling better in the short term. Over time, regular physical activity and a healthy diet can actually improve epigenomes, which as a result, it will reduce risk of chronic diseases and mental health disorders. It's a much more holistic approach to stress relief than relying on something like cannabis, especially when we don't fully understand all of its long term effects.
And even though cannabis is legal in many places, we must remain cautious as the research continues to unfold. As we've discussed before, it's about understanding the balance between managing immediate stress and making decisions that are in the best interest of our long term health.
Yeah, you don't want your health to go up in smoke.
Oh my God. The viewers may have caught it, but I don't think the listeners can see my eyes roll.
Well, I think this conversation is great and a good reminder that while modern tools and substances like cannabis may offer a short term release, the best way to age well is by prioritizing long term health through natural stress management practices, diet, exercise, and emotional well being.
Exactly. And the more we learn about the impacts of substances like cannabis, the more we can make informed choices. It's all about taking care of ourselves and each other. As far as epigenetics go, it's not about treating individuals. It's about addressing the root causes of trauma on the societal level. And what's encouraging is that we know interventions can help. There's growing evidence that when we support parents and communities through these traumas, we can mitigate some of the biological impacts and help future generations to survive.
Absolutely. Hopeful no. It shows that healing is possible, not just for individuals, but for the entire family and the community that they're a part of.
It's about resilience, and with the right support and understanding, we can start to reverse the effects of intergenerational trauma. And as science advances, we'll have more tools to be able to help us do that.
Well, this has been a powerful conversation, and it really puts things into perspective. Now, I'm hoping today's subject was educational for our listeners and, of course, our viewers. And if there are any other subjects that are out there that you would like to hear, please send us a message to the links below.
And until then, as always, keep
aging well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.